Yo! Welcome back to One More Mana. My name's Derik, and today we're getting into another exciting, and this week, spooky deck tech, because this is just my favorite time of year. Halloween is my favorite holiday, and I have my own personal Halloween themed deck. I play it year round, but it's especially fun at this time of year. And there are just so many. This deck has gone through some iterations. There are so many awesome, spooky, legendary creatures in Magic. But to me, my personal favorite to lead the deck is Jarad Golgari Lich Lord. Now, before I get too far into the specifics of this deck and any of the awesome spooky cards in here, head on over to TCG Player. Any of the cards you want in this deck, any deck you're trying to make your own version of a spooky deck, you can get anything through TCG Player, and anything you get with the affiliate link down below will help support the channel. We really do appreciate all the help. Now, jumping back into Jarad. Jarad is black, green for a 2/2 zombie elf. And Jarad loves the graveyard. That's all Jarad's about. Jarad gets +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard. Then it has the awesome ability to pay 1 a green and a black to sacrifice another creature, and each opponent loses life equal to that sacrificed creature's power. So it's like almost like a mass fling drain thing he's got going on, which is awesome. And then just gravy on top with the abilities. You can sack a forest and a swamp to go ahead and bring him back from the graveyard to your hand, meaning there's some ways to evade commander attacks late game. Now, you may ask why this is a Halloween themed deck. How is this not just a Jarad deck? Well, it's because it was inspired for me by one very specific card, the most Halloween card of all time, All Hallows Eve. It's one of my favorite cards I own. I love this card to death. And one of my favorite things about it is reserve list. It is insanely expensive. But there are tons of cards that imitate this effect, and usually more efficiently. If you're not familiar with All Hallows Eve, there's a card where you cast it. The Oracle text is nothing like what it says on the card. Basically, it almost gets like suspended with 2 scream counters, and then every turn you remove a scream counter. When those get removed, you go ahead and everyone reanimates everything from their graveyards. But again, there's so many better options, to be honest, and much cheaper options. So stuff like Living Death, Twilight's Call, that's going to do a great imitation, and that's really the whole idea of this deck. Fill your graveyard with lots of creatures, have this mass reanimation, Night of the Living Dead type deal going on, and also have the ability on your commander to be able to drain opponents out late if it gets to that. A lot of really cool graveyard synergies in here, and just an overall super fun deck. So we'll start with the creatures, and we're going to be with the creatures for a little while, because I mentioned we want lots of creatures in the graveyard. If we're casting this mass reanimation spell at one point, kind of want to have a lot of creatures to bring back. So this is the type of deck where you're going to want 40 plus creatures easy. You can go well above that. I'm at 40 because there are a bunch of non-creatures for this specific build that I do really want in here. So I'm going to be around that 40 range. And just like those other decks that I've done in the past that focus on 40 plus creatures, we need all our utility in our creatures. So we want ramp in our creatures, we want removal in our creatures, but specifically we want to focus on creatures that sacrifice themselves to do so. So something like a Caustic Caterpillar to me is just way better than a Rex Sage in this deck, because not only does it act as removal, but it sends itself to the graveyard, and we need stuff in the graveyard. That kind of goes along the same lines with something like a Dawn Treader Elk as opposed to just a regular Wood Elves. Now, we're running both in the deck, but effects like Dawn Treader Elk that not only can ramp you, but also sends itself to the graveyard are huge. So there's a few different effects like that for both removal and ramp, which we need anyway, but we get them through creatures that need to sacrifice themselves. And it's just fueling everything for us when we do stuff like that. So it's crucial to kind of get that engine running early. Now, obviously, filling the graveyard, no surprise, we're going to have our whole dredge package. So the Stankweed Imps, the Golgari Grave Troll, all that type of stuff. Basically any dredge creatures you want to throw in here, they are perfect. So that's not going to be a surprise. But one of the categories that's a little more surprising that I really do love in this deck are cycling creatures. My personal favorite is Jungle Weaver, but there's a few different that you'll see pop up on the screen that I do run. And the reason I love these cards is because they're super high CMC cards that you never want to cast. But they're great to cycle and get that engine going. It basically just gets creatures just to sit in your graveyard, gets Jarad a little bit bigger, gets a lot of the other synergies going. But the best thing is, a lot of these are big power, toughness, huge, weird vanilla creatures. And when you cast that Mass Reanimation spell, it just is gravy on top for, 2 mana, draw a card. Oh, by the way, when you cast that Living Death, there's a 5/6 spider coming at you too. It's obviously not the most ideal optimized slot, but I just have a soft spot for these cycling creatures, and it's a great way to dump stuff in the graveyard early to make sure you have something. And you want to be able to get just maximum benefit out of whatever mass reanimation effect you choose to cast. This whole category probably my favorite category. It's just a weird thing. These cards are just, I would never run in another deck, and I'm just so happy I can have a home for them. They're really fun, and when you're beating someone in the face with this weird card they've never heard of, it's just very, very satisfying. So the last category of creature kind of just fits under basically the general category. The most simple creature I think that fits this role is a Rhizome Lurcher. This is a really just good example of just, it enters, gets big based off the number of creatures in your graveyard, and it's a great thing to just sack and really do a lot of damage. Now that's the most simplified version. I'd say Boneyard Mycodrax is probably the most effective to me because it also has the scavenge ability, so you can throw those +1 counters elsewhere. You have different options. Carrion Grub I actually love. It's not based on the number, but it's based on the greatest power. So that's something that you can combo with the card we'll get to later, and I'll bring that back up. And I just love having these creatures that care about the number of creatures in your graveyard for buffs, because what it does is late game, we're able to play one of these out for relatively cheap cost and sack it to our commander and just do insane amounts of damage. We're running 40 creatures, so getting 15, 20, 25 creatures in the graveyard really isn't that hard. And that's just an insane amount of life loss that you can just deal out of nowhere. I even love something like a Ghoul Tree, which itself it doesn't have a power and toughness equal to the number of creatures, but a lot of times in this deck it's a 1 mana 10/10. So you want at least 4 to 5 of these low mana cost, huge potential power creatures that, swinging with them's not bad either, but they're great targets to go ahead and just drain everybody with our commander. And while in this deck half the time, I kind of would prefer to get the mass reanimation, get all the spooky stuff going. These are great alternate win cons, and some of the best I'll be saving for later. Now with the enchantments, we have stuff like Greater Good and Dead Bridge Chant that just are no surprise. But the one card that is by far the most fun in this deck and that I've just loved the most is Tombstone Stairwell. This card is absolutely insane if you've never played with it before. Basically every turn, everyone gets a bunch of 2/2 zombies with haste equal to the number of creatures that they have in their graveyard. And then at the end of the turn, you sack them all. This just means you're just making zombies every turn. Now, I didn't go really heavy in this deck with the Aristocrat type effects, which this combos insanely well with. But I'm running another enchantment called Moldervine Reclamation, and the other night when I was playing this deck, I got into a situation where I had a Moldervine Rec out with this Tombstone Stairwell. I only had like 8 or 9 creatures in my graveyard, which is nothing for this deck. Every turn I was making a bunch of 2/2s, had a wall of blockers, sacking them all, drawing a bunch of cards, gaining a bunch of life. This card is just absolutely insane, and if it makes it back to you, a lot of times you're going to win. It's very easy, again, to get 15, 20 creatures in the graveyard. You get 15 to 20 2/2s with haste out of nowhere. You can just start taking people out. This card is ridiculously powerful, and very few times will anyone else at the table be able to benefit the same way you do. Now, with the artifacts, Bone Horde is the most important one to me. I just love this card. Buffing something equal to the number of creatures in all graveyards. It gives you the germ to go ahead and immediately be able to activate your commander and sack that germ and just, all the life loss to everybody. We're only worried about milling ourselves in this deck, but just by the natural course of the game, other people's graveyards are going to fill up too, and this is a great way to benefit from it. You may notice a very notable exclusion. There's no Soul Ring in this deck, and I've talked about this before. I exclude Soul Rings from a lot of decks. It's not because it's a smart decision, because it's not. I just kind of got tired of sliding it in. So certain decks that really care about other things, this deck cares so much about creatures, I just put in more creature ramp and left it out. Definitely not the ideal decision, but kind of just as a flavor thing for me, I didn't include it. Obviously, if you want to cut one of the little creature ramps, throw in a Soul Ring, probably a smart idea, but I wanted to stay as on theme and flavorful as possible. With the instants, we have lots of removal. One of my favorite new cards that is just going to be great in this deck is Return of the Wild Speaker, because it's going to be great card draw for us if we get into a situation where our commander is just massive and we need to draw. A lot of our card advantage in this deck is milling ourselves, filling our graveyard, but sometimes we need that card draw, and most times we're going to have a pretty big commander, so this is a great way. Not to mention if we do mass reanimate everything, we have lots of vanilla type creatures in this deck we're mass reanimating, giving that buff might be helpful to push some extra damage through. But by far my favorite instant in this deck, not even a close second, is Gnaw to the Bone. Gnaw to the Bone is just a wonderful card. It seems just so innocuous, so useless. You just gain 2 life for every creature in your graveyard at instant speed with flashback, but in this deck, people think they might have you down, they might have you out. They might think that, oh, you're not a threat at all. You got, 2 life left, nothing. You cast this at instant speed, you can gain, 30, 40 life, no problem. All of a sudden, you're back to that top position for 3 mana. This card is ridiculous. I realize why it's not played much in EDH, but in this type of deck, it's one of the best cards in the deck. Now with the sorceries, we got stuff like Buried Alive, Jarad's Orders, Mulch, Life from the Loam. A lot of the best non-dredge creature mill effects are going to be in these sorceries, and they can really have a great impact because they're tutors within that. So with stuff like Buried Alive, not only are you filling your graveyard, but you can grab those dredgers to keep that engine going. Really, this sorcery category is so important. It will have you filling your graveyard faster than the Eagles are filling up their injured reserve list, which that's saying something. And obviously the All-Stars are in this slot as well. That Mass Reanimation, the whole point of this deck. Obviously in my list I am running Living Death and All Hallows Eve, the two most Halloween, flavorful Halloween cards of all time in my opinion in Magic. I love them so much. But again, the best thing is Living Death's a relatively affordable card, and if you don't have an All Hallows Eve, just throw in Twilight's Call. Not as on flavor, but it's going to have the same overall effect and probably more efficient because it happens right away. So I'm running 2. You could go a little heavier and run more of these effects, but I think 2 is a good place to start and then kind of gauge. Because we mill so much and because we have recursion, it's usually not too hard to get these back. And I'm actually running a Planeswalker in this deck. I'm running the new Nissa of Shadowed Boughs. This is an interesting one. I don't typically run Planeswalkers, but I opened this in my pre-release pack, so I just kind of forced it in. It seems really good in the deck because we can selectively reanimate something. We also have the ability to just dump, loyalty counters if we have any of our mass bringing lands back effects. So it's an interesting card in here. This is one of the flexible slots. I want to see how it does. Worst case, one of the additional mass reanimation effects would replace this if it kind of doesn't perform how I need it to. Now, looking at the lands are super simple, like I say, with every 2-color deck, basically. Not super important. The biggest decision for me to make in this deck was whether to go with the Golgari Guild Kit basics or to go with Innistrad basics, because, Innistrad basics are the most Halloween-y to me, but then the Golgari Guild Kit ones are so pretty, so that was really my biggest decision. You can pick whichever favorite basics you have. The lands aren't super important. I would definitely recommend a Mortuary Mire at the least, just because that is a good way to get a creature back. If you have a Volrath Stronghold, obviously throw that in here. It's an amazing card in here. As far as non-basics go, maybe Rogue's Passage is the only one I would say to force in regardless, just because the ability to have Jarad just out of nowhere murder somebody because you have a massive graveyard is a real possibility. So that unblockability could be cool, but tons of flexibility. This deck, as long as you're playing... Now, the only really time these basics come into play is if you are trying to do a Hermit Druid thing. I run Hermit Druid, but I tend to run a lot of basics too. I'm not trying to melt my whole deck at once because that gets too scary. All of a sudden, you can get your graveyard exiled and you got nothing left. You want to do it more incrementally. So this is the type of deal where you want some basics even with a Hermit Druid. I guess the last one I would mention is actually Bojuka Bog, and this is actually just a category of targeted graveyard hate in general. You need some targeted graveyard hate in this deck as far as exiling certain players' graveyards, obviously not all graveyards. Just because a lot of these mass reanimation effects, they're bringing everyone's graveyards back. So you want to be able to, if there's another graveyard player at the table, you really want to be able to take their graveyards out. So, maybe a Soul God Lantern can fit into that slot if you don't want to run the Bojuka Bog, maybe both. But you do want to have some of that hate, so that way you're the one benefiting the most. You don't want to be the one that's just everybody's having a party with their graveyard. You want to be the one having the most fun, so you got to make sure you have some of that hate in there. So that'll do it for all the categories. Let's get into the best part of every deck tech, that game-winning stuff. How are we about to win the game? And the first way is the most fun way. It is that mass reanimation, whether it's All Hallows Eve or Living Death or Twilight's Call. We want to be just bringing back a whole bunch of Jungle Weavers and Krosan Tuskers and Ghoul Trees and all these massive, ridiculous creatures we have in this deck that fill our graveyard. And then just overwhelm everybody with them. Swing out with all our big, spooky creatures and have a party. You have so much flexibility in this deck to put in pet cards and cards you love. At one point, I actually have a beta giant spider, just a vanilla giant spider. Threw it in here because you know what? I wanted to hit people with it, and eventually it would end up in my graveyard. So you have tons of all the big, dumb, vanilla creatures you've always wanted to run. If you have a way to get them in the graveyard, throw them in here, because it's always fun to dump them on the battlefield without having to pay the mana cost for them. So that is obviously going to be the spookiest and primary way to win the game in this deck. But there are tons of other fun ways as well. Secondary ways going to be to take advantage of your commander, and with some of the more explosive ways to do so. I mentioned Bone Horde. Sometimes Bone Horde with your commander right away just drains everyone for their full life total, and the game is just over. The most famous one is obviously going to be Lord of Extinction. Speaking of mass draining all your opponents, Lord of Extinction with your commander most times just wins the game. Lord of Extinction's power and toughness is equal to the number of cards in all graveyards. All graveyards, not just yours, not just creatures, all graveyards. This very few times, if you resolve your commander in Lord of Extinction at any point past turn 6, usually you just win. I'm not always a fan of 2-card combos like that, but it is just a great finisher in this deck, and Carrion Grub serves as a secondary way to do so. Now, Carrion Grub's a weird little card where its power is equal to the greatest power among creatures in your graveyard. And this is a great out-of-nowhere way. If you get that Lord of Extinction in your graveyard and you play a Carrion Grub, all of a sudden, you basically just have a second Lord of Extinction for a cheaper mana cost that you can go ahead, drain everyone for again. There's just there's so many redundant effects with that in this deck that if you can't get that mass reanimation going and you need a game to end, your commander is perfect to do that. And that's why I picked Jarad. I've had a number of different commanders. I've had Carador and a few others. And in a deck that's so dependent on this just big explosive play, you really want a really strong backup win con to end games, and your commander is the perfect way to do that in this deck. And then the final way to win the game, this card. I don't like this card. I've died to it so many times, but you know what? If you can't beat him, join him. And it is Sir Conrad the Grim. This card is ridiculous. Every time a creature goes to a graveyard, leaves a graveyard, does whatever, makes breakfast, wakes up, goes to sleep, is draining people for life. It doesn't matter what's happening. I had a very, very janky Carador deck that I had, and it was the previous version of this that was my Halloween themed deck. Didn't win very often. It couldn't win very often. But when it did, almost every time it was due to Sir Conrad. Because somehow Sir Conrad got out. And everything that happened was draining people. Mass reanimation drained people. My graveyard gets exiled, drained people. Everything just... Games just ended. Games ended if it wasn't removed. So it is a very powerful card, but it again is a good late game. It's never anything I want to tutor for or get out fast because it kind of does just take over games. But it's a great redundant effect to kind of get out there. And in some cases it does work as that graveyard protection, because if this is out and someone exiles your graveyard, it's a lot of life loss coming at everybody. And that is going to do it for this week's deck tech. I really hope y'all enjoyed it. This is really one of my personal favorite decks. I love this deck so much, mostly because I love Halloween, and All Hallows Eve I think is my all-time favorite card. So it was a great way to kind of force that to be the all-star of a deck. But even not having that card and not having the bias and the love of that card, it's still just a fun play style to go. It's so much fun for me. The whole game, you're kind of just tracking the number of creatures in your graveyards, trying to find that right moment to play that Lord of Extinction, or play that Twilight's Call, or play that Living Death, and try to just get this huge explosive play to go ahead and win the game. It's very, very fun. I know a lot of graveyard decks kind of go off of the War of Attrition type deal with the Marins and Muldrothas and a lot of those other decks, and there's nothing wrong with that. I just don't personally like that style. This is a completely different type of deck. This is the type of deck where it's some setup, but it's trying to explode and win big. And of course, it feels like I build every deck to try to do that. I don't like the whole War of Attrition type deal, apparently. But it's really cool to be able to get that play style in a deck type that normally just doesn't do that. But yes, let me know if y'all have any of your own Halloween-themed decks or any spooky decks of your own. Who's your favorite spooky commander? As always, a huge shout out to all the patrons. We love and appreciate y'all so much. Speaking of patrons, deck doctors are coming back very, very soon. We're going to have some deck doctors going. So I get to pull the lab coat out, get those goggles on, and get back in the lab to start teching those. So I'm very, very excited. Also, if y'all haven't had a chance to check it out yet, we are streaming on Saturday nights. I believe it's going to be at 8:30. Yeah, check on Twitter. For right now, I do think it's going to be 8:30 on Saturday. So if y'all get a chance to come join us, check out. If y'all ever wanted to see just how petty we can be, you'll get a live look at the pettiness. So definitely come join us. So much exciting stuff to come. Like I said, I'm squeezing this in before Commander Legends. Commander Legends is here. We have a preview card coming for Commander Legends. Just too many things to count. But until then, I will see y'all next time.